All right, so we are moving into our new unit on the Great Depression. We have finished up World War One, and we're going to kind of be in that in-between period between World War One and World War Two with the Great Depression. So we're going to talk about how American capitalism has crumbled under its own weight. Okay, so the main thing we need to focus on starting off is that this wild speculation on Wall Street, so where all the stocks are traded and all that in New York, would start to collapse the entire US economy. So this greed set up American capitalism to fail. And so there was four big causes of this. And those were the unhealthy corporate and banking setup. So unhealthy corporations and banking setup that were geared towards just helping the rich. It was self-destructive foreign trade policy, economic speculation, and income inequality. And so the main one I want you to focus on for this is income inequality. So when I say that, I'm meaning the top 5% of wealthy people in the country received over a third of all the income in this country. So over a third of our overall wealth in this country went to only the top 5%. So at the time, there was about 150 million United States citizens at the time. So 5% of them received over 1/3 of the overall wealth. That is outrageous. And so the nature of capitalism by itself is unstable. So there's always going to be booms and busts and ups and downs and collapses just by the very nature of capitalism. And so this focus on corporate profit over human need results in this permanent depression for many and these periodic rises for almost everybody else. So because of the nature of capitalism being unstable, there was that focus on corporate profit over human need. And so that caused these constant up and downs in the economy. And so the stock market really took off throughout the 1920s, the early 1920s. So the stock market increased by 20% in value every year. And so stockbrokers began allowing customers to buy on margin, which is also known as credit. So they were able to buy on credit. And so it's kind of like a credit card, if you need to think about it that way. And so people started buying stocks like crazy, even though they didn't necessarily have the money to pay for it. So they were buying it all on a credit card, just hoping that the stock market's going to continue going up and up and up. And so in the year before the crash in the stock market, the prices increased over 39%. So that is incredibly high. And so the Federal Reserve tried to kind of hit the brakes on this increase before it was too late in 1928 going into 1929. And so the Federal Reserve tried to do this by slowing the lending. So the Federal Reserve, which is in charge of all the money in the country, they tried to slow down the lending out of money to banks. And so they tried to reduce, like I said, the amount of money that banks have to loan out to people. But only a third of the banks were actually in the Federal Reserve system. And so most banks in the country were not backed and supported by the federal government, so they didn't have any help to be able to protect them if they loaned out too much money. And so this was kind of shaky under the banking system that we had out. And so the banks actually lied about the amount of money that they had available. So the banks, they kept lending out more and more money and would lie about the amount of money that they had available. So they counted money that had not yet been deposited. And so they had no money in case a bunch of people all of a sudden wanted to try to go to the bank and withdraw money. So they didn't have a way to protect against that. And lo and behold, that's exactly what's going to happen. And so the Federal Reserve started to try to cut its own revenue. So meaning the Federal Reserve tried to give more money to the people by cutting taxes, but they only cut taxes to the rich. So the income tax reduction, they started trying to cut their own revenue. So 70% of the federal revenue came from income taxes. So when I say revenue, that's like money that we collect in taxes. So 70% of the overall revenue for the year for the government came from income taxes. So what we pay each year in taxes. So the government tried to give out more money to increase spending, but they only cut taxes to the richest people. So from President Harding to President Hoover, so throughout the 1920s, President Harding was the president in the beginning of the 1920s, and President Hoover was the president at the end of the 1920s. So they cut the tax rate for the rich from 73% each year to 24%. That is a huge drop in the tax rate. So what the percentage of your income that you pay each year. So the rich went from paying 73% of their income to 24%. And so that's a lot less money that the government has coming in. And so that leads us to 1929. And this was kind of the beginning of the end, you could say. This is like when the stock market started to take these huge crashes. We see over here in the picture, October of 1929 is when we hit that peak in the stock market. So the economy is doing the best it's possible in 1929 in October. And so, like I said, in September, the Dow Jones, which is the stock market, hit a record high that had never been hit before. And so it would not hit that mark of 381 again for another 25 years. So that's like the highest it had ever been. And so then in October, you see on the map, in October, that's where the bottom falls out and they start this free fall of the stock market. Completely had a free fall. Thank you. Okay. So unemployment started to grow. We see that unemployment grew from 3% to 25% of the overall population. So 3% to 25%. And so for those who are still employed, though, their employers cut their wages. And so they started to just drop the amount of pay that they would pay people. So that would be like saying today, you made $15 an hour, and then tomorrow you come into work and your employer says, well, we're only going to pay you $13 or $10 now. That's a crazy drop in your pay. And so people began to pull money out of their banks. They were getting worried. And so they wanted to pull the money out of their banks before, if the banks just shut down. And so the banks closed when they ended up running out of money. That's what's known as a run on the bank. And so right here, these details and examples, not everybody could get their money back as banks had loaned out too much money, like I mentioned before. So I'd mentioned that banks were loaning out money like crazy throughout the 1920s in order to be able to fill those because people were investing in the stock market and everything so much. And so now these banks don't have any money to be able to protect their these runs on the bank. And so people started to essentially lose it. And so we see that banks started to fail all across the board. Banks, over 650 banks around the country failed. And so because of this resulted in a lower money supply. So people didn't have available money to get out of the banks, but they also couldn't get credit. So just like a credit card, people couldn't charge anything on credit. And so this caused this decrease in the money supply caused an increase in the value of the dollar because there's not as many dollars available. So just like if you don't have a lot of gas, then the price and value of it's going to go up a lot. So this caused the prices, though, to drop because nobody's buying things. And because nobody's buying things, the revenues go down. So tax money goes down. So because businesses aren't selling as much, they're not able to get as much in taxes. And we're going to do an activity on this in class. So if you don't get it, that's okay. And so because these businesses were not able to generate profit from nobody buying things, these businesses started to go bankrupt, which means they had to close down. And so we see in 1930, already this was bad. The stock market had crashed, businesses were closing. This is bad to begin with. But then to make matters even worse, the US gets hit by what's known as the Dust Bowl. And so this is what's going to affect the farmers in the Midwest. So the Dust Bowl hit in June of 1930. And the agricultural sector was hit the worst by both the economy hurting, which had already happened in 1929, and now the environment. And so, like I mentioned, it hit in 1930, and this was due to over farming of the farmland along with a drought is what caused this dust bowl. So people on these huge, massive farms have been farming the same crops for too long. And if you do that, that causes the soil to die out. And so it causes the dirt to just kind of become really broken up, and it doesn't have any way to grow. And so this was also compiled with a drought. There was not a lot of rain. So these dust bowls happen. That's where, these windy conditions can cause all this dust to start moving, and it's almost like a dust tornado in a way. And so thousands ended up losing their farms, and the agricultural production was completely devastated. So the production plummeted because of this. And this ended up hurting 23 states overall. So 23 out of at the time, there was 46 states. So almost half the country was affected by this. So this is going to completely kill the amount of production that is going to happen in the country. And so President Hoover at the time, Herbert Hoover, tried to fix the issue. He tried to, kind of help the farmers and also help the economy. And he signed this thing called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And this was to help struggling farmers. He hoped that it would help struggling farmers. And so all of this happened. The need to help these farmers started right after World War I. So as the world started to recover from World War I, food prices started to skyrocket. As around the world, people started to recover. So food prices go up. So this high demand for food led to expansion of farming, because more people wanting food means more farms were needed. And so this high demand for food, like I mentioned, led to an increase in land prices. So people were buying more land, which causes the price to go up. And so the farmers took on debt to get more land to grow more food. So they're saying, hey, the economy's doing well. There's going to be a ton of food needed. So, hey, I'm going to take out a loan. Even though I may not have the money, I'm going to take out a loan. It's kind of like student loans. So, but as Europe started to recover, the food prices started to go back down. So the demand, things started to even out. And so farmers can no longer sell enough to pay off the debt that they were getting from getting all this land to farm. And so the tariff, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, was passed in order to kind of help protect those farmers from prices going down across the ocean in Europe. And so it was meant to help, like I said, the struggling farmers who were hurt by the changing market, and it hit with the beginning of the Dust Bowl that same year. So both of these, this tariff, which is a tax, and the Dust Bowl, both happened at the same time. And so what resulted was struggling farmers could not be able to afford those, pay off their debts, like I mentioned, and an increase in food prices for Americans who were already suffering from unemployment in the Great Depression. So this was like a complete, like a whirlwind of all the worst possibilities happening at one time. So every worst possible outcome happened at one time. And so we see right here, the effects of the Great Depression, over 9,000 banks ended up closing. So over 9,000 banks total ended up closing over the course of the Great Depression. These were the long-term effects. And a large numbers of businesses closed after being unable to get money. So we see that, like I mentioned, industrial production fell by 50%. So over 15 million total people ended up being unemployed overall. And so of those 15, that's a quarter of the workforce. A quarter, 25% of the available people to work in this country could not get a job because of this Great Depression. And so we saw that, as I mentioned earlier, the overproduction had caused problems. Millions of tons of food were grown, but they couldn't ship it because the prices had dropped so much. So nobody was buying it, and the food was just sitting there rotting. There also was plenty of homes, but no one to live in them because they had been kicked out of their homes. So people couldn't afford rent because they didn't have a job, so they were kicked out or evicted. And so many people had to live in this thing called a Hooverville, which is like a town built on garbage dumps. So many people ended up having to move to what's known as Hoovervilles, which is like a shack that's built on a dump. So all of that leads to what's known as the bonus army that I want to make sure we cover. So the bonus army march on Washington. So after World War I, unemployed, this showed just how bad the economy was. So unemployed and desperate World War I veterans demanded their money. So we see that the World War I veterans were without work and had hungry families demanded the pay that they had been promised during World War I for fighting. So they had these bonuses that were due in the future. So the government said, hey, if you fight in World War I, we will give you this bonus, like a certain sum of money in the future. And so because things were so bad, they demanded that the Congress pay them since they were in such desperate times. And so veterans from all over the country showed up, and some traveled with their families. So close to 20,000 US veterans and their families showed up to protest and to demand their money. And so most of them actually camped along or across from the Capitol building. And so the bill that was passed in the House to pay these bonuses to the veterans passed the House, but was defeated by the Senate. And so many of the veterans ended up leaving and going home, and they went home kind of defeated. They were just like, well, I guess we're not going to get it. But many, the majority, ended up staying and actually threatened to overthrow many of the different buildings to demand their pay. And so Herbert Hoover ordered the army to evict them and kick them out, however necessary. And so literally we have members of the military coming in and attacking former members of the military. So the current members of the military are attacking, and many veterans ended up being killed. So we saw that the military was sent in, had over close to 1,000 soldiers. So they used tear gas to clear out the buildings. They set other buildings on fire. They ended up killing 2 veterans. They killed a baby and an 8-year-old. And so over 1,000 veterans overall were injured by fellow US soldiers. That is just absolutely insanity that this happened. So literally the government sent the military to attack former veterans who had fought for this country. And so all this shows that radical change was needed. And it showed that radical solutions would be the only change to help fix the issues going on in the country. So very last slide, it said a failed trickle-down solution would prove the need for radical change. So Herbert Hoover had suggested this recovery plan to help the economy recover, to help the farmers recover, and to help everyone overall recover. But his plan was to give millions of dollars to the elite bankers, and it would solve everything because the money would trickle down slowly to us. And as we know, that never actually happens. And this utterly failed because it bailed out those who were responsible for causing these issues in the first place. So all these issues was caused by greed and capitalism in the first place. But yet Herbert Hoover thinks that if you gave millions of dollars to businesses or business owners and bankers, that it would just solve the problem. And obviously it just made the situation even worse. And so the one silver lining of this economic depression was what's known as an equality of despair. So no longer was certain people being forced to just suffer. So the majority of the American public now lived with the experience similar to the harsh conditions that many minorities had been forced to live with all along. So we say the equality of despair, meaning the majority of people were now having to suffer and not just a select few. And so this was leading to a climax that was going to happen to where the country was right there on the edge of just completely collapsing and falling apart. And we're going to see in our next unit, FDR is really going to step in and demand and force through a lot of change that in many ways ends up saving the country. So make sure to take your time reading through these notes. If you need to slow it down and go back and listen to any other portions, feel free to. And we will review over these in class.